The cameras zoom in as Tiffany Trump steps onto the set of The Melissa Grayson Show. The studio lights are warm, almost inviting, but there's a tension in the air that even the most carefully curated atmosphere can't conceal. The audience watches with thinly veiled anticipation, waiting for the moment when the daughter of one of the most controversial figures in modern history will be put on the spot. Tiffany knows it, she feels it, but she walks with quiet confidence, her heels tapping against the polished floor with a rhythm that seems almost deliberate, as if she's setting the pace of what's about to unfold. Melissa Grayson greets her with a smile, the kind that doesn't quite reach the eyes. It's the smile of a seasoned interviewer who has played this game before, a smile that masks the subtle calculation happening behind the scenes. She gestures to the chair across from her, and Tiffany takes her seat with poise, crossing her legs, her expression unreadable. There's no nervousness, no flicker of uncertainty, just controlled calm. Before we continue this story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you enjoy heartfelt stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this story, so after watching, leave a comment below and tell us what you think. And don't forget, tomorrow, we have another inspiring story just for you. Welcome, Tiffany, Melissa begins, her voice carrying the perfect balance of warmth and authority. I appreciate you taking the time to be here today. I imagine it must be interesting being a Trump in today's America. The way she says it, interesting, lingers just long enough to suggest something else. The audience reacts, a quiet murmur rolling through the room. Tiffany tilts her head slightly, as if considering the question, but she doesn't rush to respond. Instead, she lets the moment breathe, allows the weight of it to settle. She knows exactly what's happening. This isn't just an interview, it's a setup. Melissa leans forward, her eyes sharp beneath the veneer of professionalism. I mean, you've had a very unique experience, haven't you? Growing up in the public eye, watching your father shape the country in ways that, let's be honest, have been polarizing. She pauses, letting the implications sink in. How does that affect you? How do you separate yourself from his legacy? It's the first real move in a game Tiffany has seen play out countless times before. The question isn't just about her. It's about pushing her toward a narrative, one that demands a specific answer, disavowal, criticism, a carefully curated soundbite that can be played on loop in news cycles for the next 24 hours. She can already see the headlines forming in real time. Tiffany Trump finally breaks her silence. Tiffany Trump speaks out against father. Tiffany Trump admits regret. She doesn't bite. Instead, she shifts slightly in her seat, the corner of her mouth curving just enough to suggest amusement, as if she's watching an old trick being performed by a magician who's lost his edge. The silence stretches just long enough for the audience to feel it, just long enough for Melissa to start to wonder if she's miscalculated. Then, finally, Tiffany speaks. That's an interesting way to phrase it, she says, her voice measured, her tone light but deliberate. She glances at Melissa, not with hostility, not with defensiveness, but with something even more dangerous: control. I didn't realize I was here to separate myself from my own family, but if that's what this conversation is about, I'm happy to clarify a few things. There's a shift in the energy of the room, subtle but undeniable. Melissa's smile falters for just a fraction of a second before she recovers, before she leans back slightly, recalibrating. Tiffany just made her first move, and suddenly, the game isn't as predictable as the host had hoped. The studio was sleek and modern, its design carefully curated to balance professionalism with a touch of theatrics. Soft golden lighting cast an artificial warmth over the set, but beneath the surface, everything was calculated. The black leather chairs, positioned just close enough to suggest intimacy, but far enough to allow for strategic body language. The polished glass table, reflecting the overhead lights in a way that made it impossible to ignore the subtle divide between guest and host, the audience mostly hidden in the dim background waiting for their cues. Applause, murmurs, carefully placed reactions that would shape the rhythm of the show. Nothing about this was spontaneous. Every detail was designed to guide the viewer's emotions, to create the illusion of a balanced discussion while ensuring control remained firmly in the hands of the one asking the questions. Melissa Grayson was in her element. Years of experience had made her a master of this environment. Dressed in a tailored navy blue suit, her posture exuded authority without seeming overtly aggressive. A veteran of high-profile interviews, she had built a reputation for being sharp, relentless, and skilled at coaxing guests into corners they never intended to occupy. She knew when to smile, when to feign concern, when to press just hard enough to make a guest uncomfortable, but not enough to appear outright hostile. That was her signature: controlled demolition disguised as discourse. Her audience adored it. They came for the spectacle, for the slow, methodical dismantling of public figures who thought they could handle her. They always left realizing they couldn't. Tiffany Trump, however, was not the typical guest. She was an enigma compared to the rest of her family, a quieter presence, less involved in the chaos of political warfare, yet undeniably part of the legacy that made her last name both powerful and polarizing. Unlike her siblings, who had embraced the battlefield of media, Tiffany had largely remained on the periphery, building a life outside the circus, but that didn't mean she was naive. She had grown up watching how these interviews worked, how narratives were constructed, how one wrong word could be twisted into a scandal that would dominate the news cycle for days. And now, she was sitting across from someone who had made an art out of extracting those wrong words from unsuspecting guests. She was dressed in an elegant but understated black dress, her blonde hair styled with just enough polish to reflect her composure, but not so much that it appeared rehearsed. Everything about her presence was deliberate, from the way she crossed her legs to the way she held eye contact with Melissa, neither aggressive nor submissive, simply unreadable. That, more than anything, made her dangerous to someone like Melissa, who thrived on guests who played into predictable emotional beats. Defensive anger, flustered justifications, desperate attempts to redirect the conversation. But Tiffany gave her none of that. Instead, she sat poised, listening, absorbing, waiting. And that patience was unsettling. Melissa's smile widened just a fraction, a silent acknowledgement that she recognized the game was not going to be as easy as she had anticipated. But that didn't mean she wouldn't win. She adjusted slightly in her chair, subtly positioning herself at an angle that signaled authority over the conversation. You know, Tiffany, I think a lot of people are curious about you. Unlike your siblings, you've stayed relatively out of the spotlight when it comes to politics, but at the same time, you've never really spoken out against anything your father has done. Do you think that silence has been a choice, or is it just easier to avoid the controversy? It was an old strategy, but an effective one. Frame the question as neutral, as if it were merely an observation, while subtly planting the expectation that the only reasonable response should involve distancing herself from her father. The audience wouldn't even register it as manipulation. They would hear it as a simple, fair inquiry. That was the brilliance of Melissa's approach. Make it seem like the guest was given every opportunity to answer freely, while ensuring that anything other than the preferred narrative would require conscious defiance. Tiffany didn't move immediately. She let the question settle, let the silence stretch just enough to make Melissa shift slightly in her seat, just enough to make the audience notice. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, measured. I think it's interesting that you frame it as silence. I'm here, aren't I? Melissa's smile didn't falter, but the flicker in her eyes was unmistakable. The first subtle shift in power. The audience might not have noticed yet, but Tiffany had, and she wasn't done. Melissa kept her smile intact, but there was a subtle shift in her demeanor, a sharpening of the edges. She adjusted her posture slightly, leaning forward just enough to signal that the conversation was about to take a more pointed turn. That's fair, she said smoothly. You're here now, but let's be honest, Tiffany. You've been noticeably absent from most discussions about your father's presidency. Unlike your brothers, who were very vocal in defending his policies, you chose a different route. Some might say you stayed quiet to avoid the backlash. Others might say you simply didn't agree with everything he stood for. So, which is it? The trap was set. It was a question designed to force a binary choice. Either she admitted to strategic silence out of fear, which would make her seem weak, or she implied disagreement with her father, which would be instantly clipped and broadcasted across every major network. The audience remained silent, waiting for the response. The weight of expectation in the room was palpable. Tiffany met Melissa's gaze with an expression so steady it was almost disarming. "Or," she said, her voice even, "maybe I just don't believe in playing the media's game." She let the words hang there for a moment, and in that moment, something imperceptible shifted. Melissa's expression remained composed, but there was an unmistakable flicker of irritation in her eyes. She wasn't used to guests refusing to play along. Melissa recovered quickly, her professionalism well practiced. She gave a small chuckle, shaking her head as if amused. "Oh, come on, Tiffany. That's a little convenient, isn't it? The media's game? That sounds like something straight out of your father's playbook. But let's talk about specifics. Let's talk about the fact that your father once said, and I quote, 'When you're a star, they let you do anything.' That comment alone sparked global outrage. As a woman, as his daughter, do you defend that?" The audience stirred at that, a ripple of anticipation moving through the room. This was the moment they had been waiting for. The moment where Tiffany would either falter or be forced to acknowledge something uncomfortable. Melissa sat back slightly, confident that she had maneuvered her into a corner. But Tiffany didn't flinch. She didn't rush to respond, didn't scramble for a way out. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, as if considering the weight of the question. Then, with perfect composure, she said, "Context matters, Melissa. And so does intellectual honesty." A beat of silence. It was subtle, but the energy in the room shifted. Melissa's expression tightened just a fraction before she responded. "So, you're saying context justifies those words? Because I think a lot of people, especially women, would disagree." Tiffany leaned forward slightly, her expression calm but unyielding. "I'm saying that if we're going to have a serious conversation, let's at least be honest about how media narratives are shaped. You and I both know that clip was weaponized out of context. And if we're talking about what's offensive to women, maybe we should also discuss how often powerful men in this industry, some of whom have sat in this very chair, were protected by the same media now pretending to hold a moral high ground." A murmur rippled through the audience, and for the first time, Melissa hesitated. It was slight, barely noticeable, but Tiffany caught it. Melissa had expected pushback, but she hadn't expected Tiffany to go on the offensive. The plan had been to make her defensive, to force her into damage control, not to have the guests start shifting the conversation onto the media itself. Melissa recovered, but the tone of the conversation had already changed. "I see what you're doing," she said, her smile returning, but with an edge. "You're trying to pivot. But this isn't about the media, Tiffany. This is about accountability. Your father had power, influence. His words mattered. Shouldn't he be held responsible for them?" Tiffany exhaled softly, shaking her head with something that almost resembled amusement. "Melissa, if accountability is really the goal, then let's make sure it applies to everyone. Or is it only convenient when it fits a certain narrative?" Another murmur from the audience, louder this time. Melissa felt it too. The script wasn't unfolding the way it was supposed to. Tiffany wasn't playing the role that had been assigned to her, and that meant Melissa was going to have to adjust. Fast. Melissa's expression didn't waver, but the sharpness in her eyes intensified. The rhythm of the interview had changed, and she knew it. She had expected Tiffany to stumble, to get flustered, to resort to carefully rehearsed talking points, or, better yet, to crack under the weight of the scrutiny. Instead, Tiffany remained composed, controlled, and, worst of all, unpredictable. That made her dangerous. Melissa had seen guests deflect before, but this was something different. Tiffany wasn't just dodging. She was turning the conversation back on her, exposing the strings behind the performance without ever raising her voice. And that could not be allowed to continue. Melissa leaned in slightly, her voice taking on a firmer edge, her smile thinning just enough to reveal the tension underneath. "You're right, Tiffany. Accountability should apply to everyone. But let's not pretend your father was just another politician being misrepresented. He actively spread falsehoods, undermine democracy and encourage division in this country. That's not media spin, that's fact. And if we're talking about responsibility, don't you think his children, especially those who benefited from his influence, should acknowledge that? The audience murmured in approval. This was the angle they were waiting for, a direct challenge, a demand for contrition. Melissa had spent years perfecting this technique, reframing every counterpoint as an avoidance of responsibility, positioning herself as the voice of reason while leaving her guest with only two choices: submit or resist. And resistance, especially on her show, never ended well for the guest. Tiffany didn't blink. Her expression remained neutral, but there was something steely beneath the surface. Melissa, if you want to have a real conversation, then let's do that, but let's at least be consistent. If we're holding leaders accountable, where was this energy when other administrations were making decisions that directly harmed American citizens? Where was this accountability when the media actively suppressed information that didn't fit the preferred narrative? Or is outrage only selective when it's politically convenient? The response landed heavier than Melissa expected. The audience, primed to cheer her on, hesitated. The silence stretched just long enough to register. She hadn't lost control, not yet, but for the first time, Tiffany had shifted the weight of the conversation. That couldn't be allowed to stand. Melissa's smile tightened. I think you're deflecting again. This isn't about past administrations. This is about your father and the damage he caused. You talk about selective outrage, but isn't it convenient that you've chosen to stay silent on issues where your voice could have made a difference? You claim the media manipulates narratives. Well, isn't that exactly what you're doing right now? Tiffany exhaled softly, shaking her head as if she had expected this. Melissa, I think you and I both know that if I had said anything, you and every other outlet would have twisted it to fit whatever narrative you wanted. If I defended my father, I'd be labeled complicit. If I criticized him, I'd be weaponized against my own family. There was never a version of this where I could have spoken without it being turned into something it wasn't. So, let's not pretend this was ever about my opinion. This was always about trying to force a headline. Melissa's grip on her cue cards tightened slightly, a flicker of irritation flashing across her face before she smoothed it over. Tiffany had hit on something uncomfortable, an unspoken truth about the way these interviews worked, about the way narratives were shaped before a guest even walked onto the stage. The audience felt it too. There was a hesitation now, a moment of uncertainty, as if they were questioning whether they had been too quick to assume how this conversation would go. Melissa adjusted quickly, shifting tactics. You keep talking about media narratives, but let's talk about reality. Your father left office in disgrace, impeached twice, banned from social media for spreading misinformation, and now facing multiple legal battles. These aren't narratives, Tiffany, these are facts. And yet, you're sitting here acting as if he's the victim of some grand media conspiracy. How do you reconcile that? The words were meant to land like a final blow, to strip away the nuance and force Tiffany into a defensive position. But instead of retreating, she did something unexpected. She laughed. It wasn't forced or bitter, it was soft, almost amused, the kind of laugh that suggested she had already anticipated this exact moment. Melissa, you just proved my point. She shook her head, leaning back slightly, her posture completely relaxed now. You say these are facts, but let's be honest. If you were truly interested in facts, this conversation wouldn't be framed around selective outrage. My father was impeached by a partisan Congress that had been trying to remove him since day one. He was banned from social media by tech executives who had a vested interest in controlling public discourse. And he's facing legal battles that are politically motivated. You can call those facts all you want, but they only tell the part of the story that fits your narrative. And the fact that you refuse to acknowledge the other side of that story tells me everything I need to know. Melissa's lips pressed together, her patience visibly thinning. The audience, which had been firmly on her side at the beginning, was now split. Some still nodded along, but others exchanged glances, as if suddenly unsure whether they had been given the full picture. That was the danger of a guest who refused to play the role assigned to them. Tiffany wasn't just holding her ground, she was forcing the audience to question whether the conversation had ever been fair to begin with. Melissa inhaled slowly, recalibrating. This wasn't over. If Tiffany thought she was walking out of this unscathed, she had another thing coming. Melissa's patience was wearing thin, but she couldn't afford to let it show. She had controlled too many interviews, dismantled too many high-profile guests to let this one slip away. Yet Tiffany wasn't reacting the way she was supposed to. She wasn't defensive, she wasn't rattled, and worst of all, she wasn't playing into the narrative that had been carefully set up for her. Melissa needed to regain control, and fast. She straightened slightly, adjusting the stack of cue cards in front of her, though they were no longer of much use. The conversation had already veered too far from the expected course. Fine. If Tiffany wanted to act as though she was above media tactics, then Melissa would take off the gloves. "Tiffany, you talk a lot about media narratives," she said, her voice measured but edged with something sharper. "But at the end of the day, the facts don't change. You've benefited from your father's name your entire life. His money, his connections, his influence. They've given you opportunities most people could never dream of. And yet, you sit here criticizing the very institutions that gave him the platform to rise in the first place. Isn't that a little hypocritical?" Tiffany barely reacted. She let the words hang in the air, let the audience absorb them. Then she smiled, just slightly, just enough to signal that something was about to happen. "Melissa," she said, tilting her head as if genuinely curious, "do you know who owns this network?" The shift was instant. Melissa's fingers tightened around her pen. It was an innocent-sounding question, but the weight behind it was immense. The audience was quiet, waiting. Melissa recovered quickly, forcing a light chuckle. "I think we both know the answer to that," she said, brushing it off. "What does that have to do with?" Tiffany didn't let her finish. "Then you also know that the parent company of this network has direct financial ties to the same tech conglomerates that censored my father. You know that the executives who sign your paycheck have personally contributed to political campaigns designed to ensure people like me never get to tell their side of the story. And you know that the outrage you're selling right now is manufactured by the very machine that benefits from controlling what the public sees and hears." Melissa opened her mouth, then closed it. The shift in energy was undeniable. The audience, which had been murmuring in agreement with Melissa just minutes ago, was now shifting uncomfortably. Tiffany wasn't just deflecting, she was pulling back the curtain, exposing the mechanics of the game in real time. And Melissa, for the first time, didn't have a pre-packaged response. Tiffany leaned forward slightly, her tone still calm, almost conversational. "You say I've benefited from my father's name. You're right. I grew up privileged. But let's not pretend privilege is exclusive to my family. You sit here on a network owned by billionaires, reading from a script written by producers who decide what stories are worth telling and which ones need to be buried. You talk about accountability, but have you ever asked yourself why certain politicians are never pressed the way my father was? Why certain scandals disappear overnight while others are dissected for years? Or is it just easier to pretend this industry isn't built on selective outrage?" Melissa inhaled sharply, but before she could respond, Tiffany continued. "You wanted to talk about hypocrisy? Let's talk about it, because if we're being honest, this isn't about my father, or me, or even this interview. This is about control. It's about making sure that anyone who doesn't fall in line is publicly shamed, smeared, and silenced. And the worst part? You're not even the one in control of it. You're just another piece on the board, following the same script as everyone else." The silence that followed was unlike anything that had come before. The audience didn't murmur. They didn't shift in their seats. They just sat there, staring, absorbing what had just happened. Melissa Grayson, the woman known for controlling every interview, for pushing every guest into submission, had just lost her grip. And the worst part? Tiffany wasn't even angry. She wasn't shouting, she wasn't defensive. She was simply stating what everyone had always suspected but had never heard spoken out loud in this setting. Melissa blinked, searching for a way to steer the conversation back, to regain the authority she had always commanded. But it was too late. The moment had shifted. The audience felt it, the cameras caught it, and by the time the clip hit the internet, it would be the only thing people remembered. Melissa forced a tight smile, but the tension in her posture betrayed her. The energy in the room had shifted in a way she hadn't anticipated, and she could feel it slipping further out of her control. Tiffany had done something few guests ever managed. She had turned the spotlight away from herself and onto the very system that Melissa was a part of. The usual tactics weren't working, the expected emotional cracks hadn't formed, and the audience, rather than nodding along in agreement with the host, was now sitting in uncomfortable silence, processing everything that had just unfolded. Melissa straightened in her chair, her voice carefully measured, but the confidence behind it had thinned. Tiffany, let's be clear, the media isn't some grand conspiracy. Journalists, networks, we report what's happening. If people criticize your father, it's because his actions warranted it. If there's outrage, it's because people demand accountability. You talk about control, but isn't it just easier to claim victimhood than to actually answer for the things your father did? Tiffany let the question hang for a moment, studying Melissa with an expression that was unreadable, yet somehow piercing. Then she exhaled softly, shaking her head, not in frustration, but in something closer to amusement. "Melissa, do you hear yourself?" she asked, her voice carrying the kind of controlled incredulity that made it clear she wasn't asking rhetorically. "You sit here on a nationally televised program representing one of the most powerful media corporations in the world, and you're trying to convince me that there is no media influence? That people just naturally come to the exact conclusions your network wants them to? That outrage just happens?" She let the weight of her words settle before continuing. "Let's talk about that accountability you care so much about. Where was this level of scrutiny when politicians outside my family made decisions that cost lives? Where was this urgency for truth when the media deliberately buried stories that didn't align with the right narrative? The problem isn't that the press holds people accountable. The problem is that it chooses who gets held accountable. And people are starting to notice." Melissa opened her mouth, but Tiffany didn't give her the chance. She leaned forward slightly, her tone still calm, still composed, but unmistakably firm. "And here's the real issue, Melissa. It's not just about my father. It's about the fact that the media doesn't tolerate dissent. It's about the fact that anyone who doesn't fall in line, who doesn't give the right answers, who doesn't play the role they've been assigned, is labeled dangerous. And for years, you got away with it because people were too afraid to call it out. But that's changing." The murmurs in the audience had returned, but they weren't the same as before. This wasn't just mindless agreement or pre-programmed applause. It was uncertainty, realization, the uncomfortable sensation of seeing the strings that had always been there but had never been so openly pointed out. Tiffany wasn't just defending herself anymore. She had turned this into something much bigger than an interview. Melissa knew it too. She could feel the shift. See the way Tiffany had managed to slip through every carefully laid trap without even breaking a sweat. The frustration was just beneath the surface, barely hidden by the professional composure she had spent years perfecting. She had one last move. "So what now?" she asked, feigning a casual smile. "You think you've won? You think calling out the media changes anything? Your father is still under investigation. Your family name is still polarizing. The headlines are still going to be written, whether you like them or not." Tiffany studied her for a long moment, then let out a small, knowing exhale, almost as if she pitied her. "Melissa, I don't need to win. That's the difference between us. You're playing for control. I'm just telling the truth. And the funny thing about the truth? Once people hear it, they don't forget." Melissa didn't respond. She couldn't. Because in that moment, everyone in the room, from the audience to the crew to the millions who would watch this later, knew that Tiffany had just won something much bigger than an argument. She had walked into the lion's den and walked out untouched. And no carefully spun headline was going to change that. The interview ended, but the real spectacle was just beginning. Within minutes of Tiffany Trump walking off the set, clips of her responses flooded social media. Twitter exploded first. The hashtag #TiffanyOwnsMelissa shot up the trending list, accompanied by thousands of posts dissecting every exchange. Users posted side-by-side comparisons of Melissa's usual interview style, guests squirming under pressure, stumbling over their words, against Tiffany's effortless Someone clipped the moment when Tiffany asked who owned the network, slowing it down for effect. "This is the second she knew she lost," the caption read. It was retweeted over 50,000 times in under an hour. YouTube was next. Multiple channels uploaded the interview, each title more dramatic than the last. "Tiffany Trump destroys liberal journalist" racked up millions of views. Comment sections filled with variations of the same sentiment. She didn't just win, she dismantled the entire system in real time. Even those who had never followed Tiffany before were suddenly paying attention. Reddit threads dissected her every word, breaking down how she had flipped the narrative, how she had exposed the illusion of journalistic neutrality without ever raising her voice. "She played the long game," one user wrote. Melissa thought she was leading the conversation, but Tiffany was letting her dig her own grave. Legacy media scrambled to respond. Major outlets ran damage control, framing the interview as tense and contentious rather than an outright loss. Op-eds appeared overnight, subtly shifting the focus. "Tiffany Trump's deflections say more than her words," one headline read. Another claimed, "Why right-wing media is celebrating a nothing moment." But the problem was, people had already seen it. The unedited clips were everywhere. The corporate spin didn't matter. The audience had witnessed it themselves, and no amount of post-analysis could undo the shift in perception. Melissa Grayson, usually quick to post triumphant recaps after high-profile interviews, was silent. No victory lap, no celebratory behind-the-scenes clips. Just silence. And in that silence, the message was clear. This wasn't just another interview, this was a moment, a shift, a crack in the carefully controlled facade of media power. And the people watching, they weren't forgetting anytime soon.